or Minchen, if I may say, folk intellectuals, people's intellectuals. The abstract of his presentation is the new cultural movement. New culture movement gave birth to a figure that played a central role in the history of 20th century China, that is, Mayforth intellectuals. They inherited the elitist mindset of the imperial literati, even as some of them called to go to the people, Tao Min Chen Shi. In their wake, an alternative tradition of engaging with grassroots society emerged over the span of the 20th century. Lucian's The True Story of AQ, which satirizes both traditional literati and modern intellectuals, stands as an ambiguous milestone in modern intellectuals' engagement with Mintian society. With this, I now request Professor Sebastian Waits to please present his paper.
Thank you very much. I'm very pleased and honored to be here, and I do apologize that Wednesdays is my heavy teaching day, so I can't spend more than this single panel with you today, but I do look forward to catching up on the other panels that I missed. So without further ado, let me start on with my presentation. I won't use a PowerPoint because I thought it was not really necessary for this very well-known text. I will just read my paper and look forward to comments and thoughts from everyone. So as we know, the May 4th movement famously saw the rise of China's modern intellectuals. So I'm going to try to discuss a little bit the significance of this piece of fiction, AQ, from the point of view of the history of intellectuals and the sort of changes in the figures of intellectuals in China. So as Professor Hermann Lacker just noted, the May 4th intellectuals inherited some of the defining traits of the imperial literati. This was studied at great length by historians like Benjamin Schwartz or Lin Yusheng. In particular, the propensity to take responsibility for society and the nation. They advocated progressive ideas like science and enlightenment, while at the same time holding on to their kind of elite position within the social structure. Although they were often criticized for their factionalism, for their elitism, for their fascination with theory, sometimes for their snobbery and eagerness to imitate the latest Western fads, they also dominated the intellectual field all the way until at least 1949 and perhaps beyond. Before the 1911 revolution, literati were described as scholar officials. They were known as shidafu, as opposed to commoners. Their status was defined by the existence of the imperial examination system, and their mission, though also political and epistemic, was first and foremost a moral one. They were tasked with providing moral guidance to the state and the community. They were also called upon to take responsibility for the affairs of the world, as the famous expression 以天下为己任, or taking the entire world for their own responsibility, or as Timothy Cheek in his more recent book on intellectuals in 20th century China put it, to work for the public good, 为公如何. After the imperial examination system was abolished in 1905, then followed by the imperial institution itself, which disappeared in 1912, the term shidafu gradually gave way to two other terms. The first was this idea of a knowledge class, or 知识阶级, a translation of the Russian term intelligentsia, which first came to Japanese in its Japanese pronunciation chishikikaiku, and its cognate chishikijin, or intellectual, which this cognate didn't make the transfer into Chinese. And Lu Xun in particular mentions an influential talk given by the Russian writer Vasily Eroshenko in 1922, which was published in the Chenbao, the same newspaper as published AQ, under the title The Mission of the Intellectual. The Chinese title was 知识阶级的使命. From the 1920s, this term was replaced by the more politically correct notion, speaking from the perspective of a group of people overwhelmingly attracted to the orbit of communism, a more politically correct notion of knowledgeable elements, or 知识分子. So rather than constituting a class of their own, which would inevitably be a kind of subclass of the bourgeoisie, the intellectuals could and should be dissolved within the working class as elements engaged in awakening and ultimately empowering the working class. So this is the term that stuck, and it was further institutionalized within the PRC class system after 1949, when 知识分子 was defined as anyone with secondary schooling, and who did not engage in manual work, thus encompassing many levels of clerks and office workers in state administrations. Lu Xun is often presented as the epitome of the May 4th intellectual, but it should be recognized that he accepted this role only reluctantly. The sympathetic support for the May 4th avant-garde that he expresses in the preface to Nahan cannot really obscure the ironic undertone of this preface text, in particular as to the ability, or lack thereof, of the new literature to change minds and remedy social ills. While the contrast between the unawakened masses and the awakened avant-garde of students and their teachers is a strong theme in May 4th writing, Lu Xun took a more skeptical view of the ability of intellectuals to mobilize the masses than the student activists of 1919. Embracing Max Stirner's critique of the politics of the crowd, Lu Xun penned acerbic satires of China's accused who gaped and cheered as revolutionaries were executed. Yet no more did he spare the intellectuals who advocated forms of democratic or people-based politics, while asserting their own position as an avant-garde elite entitled to speak out for the masses. They presented their knowledge as a form of enlightenment or a tool for social and political emancipation, but Lu Xun often took them to task for their monistic and conformist approach to knowledge and science. Speaking in November 1927 in Workers' University in Shanghai, 国立劳动大学, which was established by Tsai Yuen-pei and some other former anarchists who remained in the Kuomintang after the White Terror, Lu Xun recalled that since Eroshenko's speech and essay had introduced the Russian concept of intelligentsia in 1922, intellectuals and knowledge had been often criticized, and intellectuals had even been killed in China. So Lu Xun noted a difference in the status of the intelligentsia in Russia. And he asks, why is this? Because they can express outrage on behalf of the common people, 平民. They can make the sufferings of the common people known to the masses, 大众. Why can they do so? Because they are close to the common people, or they are even common people themselves. Lu Xun goes on to argue that European writers are often of common origin, which he explains by the simpler writing system, even if they may become estranged from common people when they become famous. While in his view, in China, literati and academics have been cut off from the people for many centuries. However, Lu Xun didn't really take this critique any further in this 1927 text. Rather, his speech goes on to glorify action and decisiveness, which is contrasted with those thinkers who so carefully weigh losses and gains that they are always averse to taking risks. The critical disposition of intellectuals is therefore mocked as a kind of weakness, which makes intellectuals into eternal victims of the state. But it is also deeply ineffectual when compared with decisive action. In Lu Xun's view, the intellectual's complaints are usually harmless, and for this reason, they are easily tolerated by tyrants. So while this 1927 essay contains a critique of the May 4th intellectual's avant-garde claims, it also leads to a kind of outright rejection of knowledge and an implicit call to do away with intellectuals as a class. AQ, written several years earlier, can to some extent be read as a less self-defeating version of Lu Xun's reckoning with the dysfunctional relationship between the intellectual avant-garde and the people. Written and serialized in the Beijing Chenbao from December 1921 to February 1922, it marks the breakup within the garden of new culture. As we know, by the summer of 1920, the editors of New Youth had each taken their own paths, and the journal moved with Chen Duxiu to Shanghai, becoming a communist organ. Just when the liberals and radicals agreed to make one more final attempt to cooperate in February of 1921, the concession police in Shanghai raided the journal's offices, and Chen Duxiu moved the journal with him to Guangzhou. New Youth was therefore no longer available as this kind of common space for the new culture consensus. And therefore, Lu Xun chose the supplement edited by Sun Fuyuan to Pu Dianzun's Chenbao as a venue for the publication of AQ. So in this story, as we know, the narrator who dresses up the episodes of the protagonist's life in the mock heroic style of an uplifting biography is undoubtedly poking fun at the Confucian scholar's propensity for moralizing, at the same time as he is mocking AQ's own self-aggrandizing tendencies. However, it's quite hard to see AQ as a potential member of a future revolutionary proletariat awaiting the enlightenment of the May 4th intelligentsia, or even as a citizen in the new democratic community. He seems hopeless. While the narrator sympathizes with him to the point of lending words to his cry for help, as famously argued by Marston Anderson, AQ's understanding of revolution never goes beyond looting, harassing nuns, and generally bullying anyone weaker than himself. Indeed, some may see him as a future Red Guard enabled by the narrator's leniency, when the narrator highlights, both ironically but perhaps also regretfully, that AQ is not permitted to take part in the revolution, when this phrase, which is uttered by the fake foreign devil, becomes one of the chapter titles of the novella. More generally, given the highly constructed and self-reflexive structure of AQ Zhengzhuan, it's hard to see how it could, to quote Lu Xun's 1927 essay, make the sufferings of the masses available to the common people. However, there may be another way of reading that connects with the parallel intellectual tradition. Sun Yu has remarked on the significance of Lu Xun as a Minjian intellectual, an intellectual among the people, and the later influence of this strand on the writer Xiaohong. Sun Yu argued that what he calls a pre-ideological Lu Xun has always inspired readers from the margins and the lower ranks of society because of his grassroots discourse and values, in particular, the humor and concreteness of his fiction. AQ, of course, is a case in point. Many examples of these humorous and concrete episodes, like the flea counting contest between AQ and Wang Huzi. AQ also illustrates a kind of anti-authoritarian streak that is encapsulated in local culture and finds its full expression when AQ sings strands of local opera while parading down the village main street. AQ's truculent resistance to administrative authority, in particular the authority of the Dibao, the local official who represents the local state in regulating AQ's daily life, but also the judge and the executioners, is steeped in this culture of local opera and local culture. In parallel to the great tradition of May 4th, it may therefore be possible to tease out a different intellectual strand, one that's not so much based on the sense of entitlement and responsibility towards society and the nation, and is maybe less closely tied to the position of the social and cultural elite that dominated May 4th discussions. As Zygmunt Baumann argued, intellectuals who sought to embrace the role of interpreter rather than legislator had to begin by accepting that members of the working class were not simply Pygmalions for an avant-garde eager to lecture them on their nascent class consciousness. If we go back to some other studies of the May 4th period, Li Xiaoti, in his study of the late Qing grassroots Enlightenment movement, or what he calls the Dicang Qimeng Yundong, notes that it marked the first time that commoners were envisaged as citizens. He goes on to point out that while in May 4th times, intellectuals were called upon to go to the people, so this famous slogan, 到民间去, which was borrowed from the Russian Narodnik movement of the 1870s, very soon after May 4th, in fact, the people, or the Minjian, became the masses, or the Minzhong. And the new kind of elitism gave intellectuals the prerogative to decide which forms of folk culture were legitimate and which forms of folk culture had to be denounced as feudal. So this is on the way to the kind of transition to the Marxist avant-garde role of the intellectuals. Yet in the brief moment around 1919, when teachers and students fanned out to rural villages around Beijing to both lecture to workers and farmers, as well as to observe customs, carry out social surveys, and collect forms of local culture, a less didactic mindset prevailed among enthusiasts of the folk culture movement. Although the Chinese Communist Party tried to incorporate folklore into its own cultural production, in particular later during the Long March, just like the KMT before it, the CCP struggled to accept the feudal, so-called feudal aspects of Minjian life. Chu Qiubai, for example, criticized folk stories as being benighted and advocated the exclusive practice of proletarian literature. By contrast, Lu Xun's brother, Zhou Zuoren, who became interested in myth and Japanese folklore in Tokyo under the influence of Yanagita Kunio, joined the folk culture and new village movements around the time that AQ was written. Though indebted to May 4th thinking, Zhou Zuoren was hesitant to take this kind of avant-garde stance vis-a-vis folk culture. So a quote from his essay, Villages and Taoist Thought, 乡村与道教思想. What I wanted to revise is that now I think it is impossible to have radical and thorough changes. It is useless to carry out the scientific movement in the fashion of a missionary movement. So this is a very kind of poignant critique of the May 4th ideal of enlightenment and science. This has been more broadly explained by Li Tonglu in the article To Believe or Not to Believe, Zhou Zuoren's Alternative Approaches to the Chinese Enlightenment. In particular, that article argues that in Zhou's belief, in Zhou's view, the new beliefs of enlightenment, national salvation, and the communist revolution were just as irrational, oppressive, and violent as the old ones. Modern intellectuals, therefore, had to be self-reflexive. They could not regard themselves as representatives of any absolute truth with the right to violently eliminate the ghosts of the past. So this idea of the ghosts of the past is a very important one that comes back in both Lu Xun and Zhou Zuoren's writing. Because, as Li Tonglu continues, those ghosts could possess the new intellectuals at the very moment they resort to rationality and to radical and violent approaches. So Zhou can be understood as a kind of Minjian intellectual in the sense that he respects so-called superstition and popular belief and takes a non-normative attitude towards subaltern groups and seeks to understand them rather than to educate them. So his insistence on the need for a reflexive, self-critical position of the intellectual is also relevant, I would say, with respect to AQ. So coming back after this somewhat lengthy detour to the text under discussion today, Zhou Zuren also offers a long and detailed exegesis of the true story of AQ in the collection Lu Xun 小说里的人物, the characters in Lu Xun's fiction. Which considers not so much the fictional narrative, but the objects, people, and events on which the story was likely based. So what's important here is that Zhou does not pass judgment on any of AQ's acts or any of the situations he encounters, but rather he tries to consider how likely each one is to have happened the way it was told, providing, for example, a detailed account of the status and the duties of the Dibao or some of the other characters. Read in the light of Zhou Zuren's comments, Lu Xun's text arguably evinces some sympathy from the reader for AQ and his ways, but not based on a feeling of superiority in the position of the all-knowing intellectuals, the intellectual who has the ability to educate the people. However laughable and petty AQ may be, he's nonetheless an authentic and in some way irrepressible expression of a society that appears more complex than any of the ideological templates that the May 4th intellectuals like to impose on him. While Lu Xun depicts the old gentry elite as profoundly corrupt and hypocritical, the young radicals, like the fake foreign devil, are in fact just as misguided and pretentious. Perhaps they can serve as a vivid illustration of those missionaries that Zhou Zuren is criticizing, or of the so-called middle country radicals from southern Zhejiang, studied famously by Ye Wenxin, who a few years later drove the new culture movement in Hangzhou before joining the nascent Communist Party. AQ, by contrast, is redeemed at least by the authenticity of his cultural references that stand out when he is singing opera or gossiping about the habits of the townspeople. So to conclude, Lu Xun's position as the author with respect to the character AQ is somehow different from the way in which most May 4th intellectuals chose to go to the people. AQ is neither particularly worthy of sympathy, nor is he depicted as a source of possible social change, even less of a political project. Nonetheless, he has something to tell intellectuals and his readers about Chinese society if they are able and willing to listen. And I will stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Sebastian. I mean, I must add here that what we have heard from Sebastian Wedge today is based on, if I may say, on his most recent book, which was published from Columbia University Press in 2019. And the title of the book is Min Qian, The Rise of China's Grassroots Intellectuals. I mean, I really do not, should not dare to sum up the lecture. And I should move on to the next speaker, because as I mentioned earlier, our next speaker is Professor Chang Ishin, who's actually packing her bags to go to the airport to catch a flight, or maybe she's already on the way to the airport. Let me quickly introduce Professor Chang Ishin. Professor Chang Ishin is a senior researcher at the Beijing Lushun Museum and specializes in Lushun studies and new culture movement studies. She has a PhD in modern Chinese literature. She's a well-known Lushun scholar and is widely known in China, Japan, South Korea, and in Europe. Her recent books include Reading Husher, that was in May 2012, The Enlightenment and Literature of Each Other's Methods, published in 2010, and then Reading Lushun in 2014. And in 2016, her latest book came out with the title Red Building, The New Cultural Landscape. She has authored numerous articles on Lushun and on modern Chinese literature in Chinese. May I now request Professor Chang Yi-shin to present her paper?
Hi, hello everyone. Thanks for Professor Hammond's invitation. It's a great honor to attend this online conference and exchange ideas with other scholars so as to commemorate the 100th anniversary of the publication of Lu Xun's classic novel, The True Story of RQ. And my topic is The True Story of RQ, an anti-Cis novel. And I share it's very simple. The True Story of RQ is the most frequently commented novel in the history of Chinese modern literature. It has been translated into many languages and commands a wide audience. The image of RQ, created by Lu Xun, has become a typical figure to the world literature. His means of spiritual victory has communicated the soul of different nations in the world. RQ's spirit is also the most discussed topic in the history of the study of this story. RQ is found in everyone's life around the world. Just as this online conference concept note mentions that this famous novel is anti-feudal, anti-rulers, anti-revolution, anti-modern, and anti-classics. I would like to add that another perspective of this work, that is the obvious antithesis color between the lines from the preface to the whole text. At the beginning of the novel, the ridicule of biographical titles is smeared with a bright antithesis color. We are very familiar with this following phrase. As you know, the ideal pursued by Chinese traditional scholars all their lives is morality, faith, and works. 立德、立功、立言. This is called the three immortality. Fully reflects the literati sense of mission to maintain the Confucian cultural order and their cultural ideal of self cultivation. Therefore, we can see that there are all kinds of outstanding figures in the official history. In classical China, no one has ever wrote a biography of an unknown champ. RQ took the pen for the first time before he died, and he can't draw around the circle. In fact, such people are the silent majority who are not seen in the history. However, Lu Xun gave RQ a far from immortal work. RQ's life was like a grassroots. Obviously, Lu Xun is subverting the so-called three immortal values of the Holy Scriptures and the theses. The theses here are not only the traditional Confucians, but also represent all the spiritual authority. The most ingenious part of Lu Xun is that he made up the art world of Wei Zhuang. Then it abstracts the spiritual authority of Confucianism, Buddhism, and Taoism with three cultural symbols. Where is the color of the antithesis reflected in the true story of RQ? How does Lu Xun do it? I think in the fictional world of art, we can see the three symbols. First is the symbol of Confucian culture. That is the Zhao family, the first family in Weizhuang. The true story of RQ depicts a kingdom lacking benevolence, eliminate desire, and ruling by courtesy. The three-generation contemporaries period advocated by Confucius, which resembled a harmonious family, has long evolved into an orderly network of respect and distinction. Wei Zhuang is self-evident as its supreme ruler, Mr. Zhao, and is praised to such an absolute degree that Mr. Zhao could do no wrong. Names and birthplaces in Weizhuang are the signs of family blood relatives. Losing them means losing the cultural roots on which to survive. As a common people, RQ has no name, no sense of existence, just like a grain of dust. Have the one who achieved glory by writing ever given attention to such a life? The narrator directly questioned the basic premise of who was the representative of history to achieve glory by writing. The successful county candidate in the Zhao family proposed to expel RQ, who suddenly expelled him out of Wuizhuang. But Mr. Zhao stopped it, and the reason is the eagle does not prey on its own nest. Lu Xun called this is parental instruction. RQ is always in the position of master in spirit, but in action he wants to be a slave. This duality of master and slave has been bred in the traditional soul of China's family world and is further strengthened by the Confucian ethical hierarchy. It cannot but be said to be the biggest abuse of Confucianism. However, RQ is not incurable. He has even the vigor revolutionary demands. Will he always be willing to survive ignorantly? RQ is anxious to be enlightened, but how did the social circumstances and traditional Chinese culture educate him? We see there are many ideas in RQ's mind that are in line with the Confucian masterpiece, but have no self-understanding. He proposed to Ama Wu on the ground that there are three forms of unfilial conduct, of which the worst is to have no descendants. He found a magnificent reason for his reasonable lust. He defended his dignity by saying that gentleman uses his tongue, but not his fists. My family was much richer than you. This word is ridiculous. A son beat his father. He hated the bogus foreign devil's fig pigtail and thought that his wife is not a good woman if she didn't jump back to the well for the fourth time. The majority of Chinese men could become saints and sages were it not for the unfortunate fact that they are ruined by women. I think the narrative logic of the official history is deeply ironic in the implicit and meaningful converse. My family was much richer than you. This word is ridiculous, a son beat his father, and other Confucian ethics in RQ. Who has never taken a pen and has not drawn a circle can be self-taught. Where does his spiritual source come from? Lu Xun picked up the local folk opera for it. RQ opened his mouth and became the expression of culture Chang and the collective unconsciousness of the nation. This is the potential of ancient Chinese folk literature and art to promote people's spiritual success. The second symbol of is Buddhism is a convent of quiet self-improvement. RQ has long been reduced to the bottom of society, but he had always had the greatest contempt for the little nun in convent of quiet self-improvement. In order to win the idler's laughter, the nature of motivated anger is fully displayed. RQ teased the little nun and caused the spectators in the tavern to laugh. Lu Xun jokingly called his action is appreciation of feat. 巡夜得到赏识. RQ believes that all nuns must carry on in secret with monks. The holy practitioners have become synonymous with human desire. Lu Xun had spoken so highly of Buddhism. He used to copy a lot of Buddhist scriptures. But in the true story of RQ, he reads one of the most profound thoughts here. The fate of Buddhist culture in the true story of RQ be mocked and vent anger in this way. The most typical are the revolutions of Boger's foreign devil and the successful county candidate. They smashed the dragon plaque of Long Live the Emperor and took away the Xuande furnace in front of the Guanyin Empress seat. The old nine was also treated as a government full of stakes and chestnuts. The Buddhist Holy Land took on all this with silence, reflecting the poetic era of the decline of Buddhism. The decline destiny of Buddhism goes further. Akyu was severely punished by molesting Ama Wu. One of them was take a pair of red candles, weighing 1 pound each, and a bundle of incense sticks to the Zhao family to atone for his misdeed. Although the Zhao family does not burn incense and candles because the first lady of Zhao family can use it when she worships the Buddha and keep it. If Miss Zhao really embraces comparison and belief in Buddhism, she shouldn't squeeze a tramp who has nothing in this way. It can be seen that Miss Zhao's worship of Buddha was definitely not based on Sin's inner beliefs, without the mercy hard to deliver living creature, but a kind of window dressing. Buddhism is not only suitable for the spiritual comfort of the ruling class, but also very suitable for Akil himself. The idea of sixth transformation of human life led to his indifference to death and the potential imagination of victory in the next life. Akil's physical death has become an unavoidable choice for the writer, implying that there is no way for live individuals living in modern Chinese society. Most importantly, Buddhism is only in the destiny of individuals in the present text after passing through history. Culture unconsciousness is also the pursuit of immortality. There will be a hero in 20 years. The third symbol in this text is about the Taoism, that is the Tolerant God's temple. The true story of Akyu also implies Luxin's deep thinking about the Taoist culture. It is no accident that Akyu lives in the Tolerant God's temple. This is a temple to worship the gods of land and grains. It belongs to the theological pedigree of Taoism and developed from the beliefs of Chinese folk gods. China's ancient culture originated in the Yellow River Basin. Since entering the agricultural society, the most basic means of production is the land, and the most basic source of food and clothing is the grains and something hemp. This has gradually led to the worship of the earth and grains, representing the gods of the land, 社稷. The earth carries all things, nourishes life, and also carries sense of creation. Our food, clothing, shelter, transportation, birth, old age, sickness, and death depend on the earth for maintenance, but we only repay her with caring. We should follow the great spirit of selflessness and inclusiveness of the earth. But in Weizhuang, only the tutelary God's temple accept homeless RQ. Doesn't this symbolize Mother Earth's broad mind? However, RQ not only has no sense of awe, but also very indifferent to this. The old man in charge of the temple also impersonal for RQ. Because of the Amawu's instinct, the old man made some uncalled for remarks and led Akio to leave the temple. This is exactly the same as Mr. Zhao's treatment of Buddhism. On the surface, it is one set of worship, but in reality, it is another set. In addition, Ama Wu felt humiliated by Akio and wanted to suicide, so Zhao family asked Taoist priests to exorcise evil spirits, and Akio paid for the fee. Though RQ is a loser, he achieved spiritual victory by seeing in his mind that he was really one. This spiritual victory method is the heritage of Taoism. This can be said to be the most thought-provoking aspect of RQ, and it is also the profound meaning of Lu Xun's saying that China is rooted in Taoism. In the long history of human culture, if the realm of Confucius, Laozi, and Buddha is like the sea, then Confucianism, Buddhism, and Taoism have become spiritual phenomena with certain scope and limitation. When it comes to the formation of Confucianism, Buddhism, and Taoism, it is inevitable that there will be a chain of gradual alienation. In the true story of RQ, Lu Xun pointed the seafarer to the alienated Confucianism, Buddhism, and Taoism. To be more precise, it was the early corrupt Confucianism, Buddhism, and Taoism, which enabled people to see what kind of culture soil the weakness of national character was bred on. When Lu Xun began the practice of new culture, he learns from the ancients, from the classical literature, critically inherited the way of nature in classical literature, removed the shadow of traditional ethics and morality, abruptly descended and dispelled the authority of sages, recoded literature with modern poetics, and made literature return to the human nature. Okay, that's my report. Thanks for listening. Very sorry because there's another meeting, so I can't participate in the interactive session. I look forward to our offline opportunity for in-depth communication. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Chang, Ishin.
Okay.
Yeah, and thank you for making efforts to participate and present your paper. I know you are busy and you have to now perhaps leave for your travel abroad, as you had mentioned. So you may not be joining us for question and answer session. Is that right?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, okay. My request to participants that if you have any questions, you can directly speak up your questions to the speakers, or you can go to the participants window and there you will see the option of raise hands, and then you can click on that, and then we can by turn invite you to ask your question. So any questions to the speakers? We can start the question answer session right away. Yes, 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 Mr. Giri, please.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Professor Beck. You brought a very interesting dimension, Lu Xun and his brother's interest in folk culture and the village movement. So that points to a possible tension in Lu Xun between kind of modernism and folk culture. And so I request you to kindly elaborate the challenge of, the Marxist tradition and the modernizing process and the element of the folk and also the place of the village in this journey. If Lu Xun was also interested in rural reconstruction. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, that's a very important question. I think, I mean, of course, AQ is maybe not the most eloquent text in this regard, but there are various other novels or essays by Lu Xun in which he delves further into this kind of village culture or folk culture and its meaning for him. So of course, his text Guxiang or My Hometown is one of the most well-known ones in this respect. So it talks about how the narrator, who is a kind of character who somehow resembles Lu Xun, kind of modern intellectual, goes back to his home village to sell the family house and pack up whatever is left of the family's affairs over there, and bumps into this character who used to be his childhood friend or playmate, and who's now grown up and become a kind of how should I say, estranged from, I mean, the social classes have sort of taken over the sympathy between the two children. So, so Lu Xun, I think, devoted some thought to this issue. Of course, there's a lot of context that is often kind of left out, that has been recently highlighted more perhaps in studies of the May 4th era. The fact that there was all this reflection about villages, the folklore movement, the question of, I mean, let's say that the traditional narrative has very strongly highlighted the direct line from the kind of patriotic, so-called patriotic demonstrations, anti-imperialist, anti-feudal movement of May 4th, 1919, to the establishment of the Communist Party in 1921, and the kind of, let's say, embrace of Marxism by Chinese intellectuals. So, of course, the actual situation was rather more complicated. So, this question of rural culture and folklore was not something that only appeared on the horizon of intellectuals in Yan'an or during the Long March. It's inherent in the May 4th period. So let's say that in some of the main May 4th publications, this issue of the New Village movement and utopian communities and how intellectuals could go to villages and make themselves useful there by lecturing or by setting up kind of utopian communes. This is something that was widely discussed at the time. So certainly Lu Xun would not be ignorant of that. I hesitate to say that Lu Xun takes a directly kind of anti-Marxist position, but I mean, that's kind of what I'm trying to suggest in my paper, that Lu Xun very early on is somehow not satisfied with this kind of very standardized kind of Marxist view that was developed, of course. So AQ was problematic for some of the early Marxist critics. We know this famous text by Qian Xingcun, right, Ying, who famously wrote in 1927, "The era of AQ is over." So the Marxist critics were very eager to place AQ in the past, and say that this was of course a realistic and useful description denouncing the evils of feudal society, but AQ was a character who was supposed to, whose destiny, whose teleological mission was to disappear from the stage of history. So Lu Xun certainly is not trying to make him disappear, I would say. He's much more kind of interested in digging into this character and showing the various facets of this character. So of course, AQ is not, I mean, the story of AQ is not a kind of study in folklore as some other text by Lu Xun might be. But I think it kind of encapsulates the ambiguity of rural culture in ways that other May 4th texts might not.
Thank you. Any more questions to?
Yeah. May I?
Yeah, please.
Rawat sir, are you going to ask?
No, पहले आप कर लीजिए, कोई दिक्कत नहीं. As the chair, yeah. I no question.
Thank you.
Please.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Professor Chang and Professor Sebastian, for this very, I don't know. I mean, I'm really fascinated how Professor Chang actually puts it into the three cults. Lucian also calls it the three cults, like Buddhism, Taoism, and Confucianism. And he clearly brings out the fact that they have their limitations and they do not provide the answers. But as Professor Sebastian also said, that he was rather different from the Mayforth intellectuals, and also once again you reiterated that perhaps he was also partially anti-Marxist and was not very keen on going by the typical Marxist line of thought. So was he just focusing on bringing out the issue, as we always, whenever we discuss Lucian, this is what it happens. All his themes are very problematic and unfortunate. So he's just focusing on bringing out the issue, but he's not having an answer, or perhaps he's saying that don't take anything as the answer and just dwell on it before you take any path. So that's something which has come again, once again, to our minds. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Can I?
Yeah, Rawat ji पूछिए.
Yeah. ज़्यादा नहीं मैं short करूँगा, but yeah. First of all, I really thank all the speakers who are speaking, Professor Bij, Professor Chang Ishin, and Professor Raman Sinha, that yes, I was personally benefited by listening to them. But I have not a question, but curiosity just to know from Professor Biz, as well as from the Chinese Professor Chang Yixin, right? Yeah, yeah. Professor Biz, really what I found Lucian bit complex, not only in the context of RQ, but I was just rereading, of course, rereading this Happy Family, the divorce, the misanthrope, in the wine shop, the New Year sacrifice, regret for the past especially. I could found him so complex that there are idea of Buddhism, ghost, heaven, hell, Tagore, Ibsen, Huxley, and so much complex, right? So much complex through the mouth of speaker he is saying. But I find there is a strong autobiographical element in all these story. I don't know. I request you to just could you say something that am I right in saying this? Very strong autobiography. It's not that way, right? Marxism or anyism. Very ideological. Very autobiographical reflection in his character, as though Lucian is speaking this and hiding himself in some garb that way. I hope, am I clear? If not, then yeah, is there a kind of a strong autobiographical element in all these stories? What Lucian is writing. There is a heaven and hell, Buddhism also, Taoism also, this also, that also.
Yeah, so, Sebastian, you can take off now, and then we can have more questions.
Okay. Let me just say something to those two questions or comments. Yes, thank you. I fully agree with the two remarks. There is this kind of inconclusiveness, and they go very well together, actually. So there is this inconclusiveness in Lucian's writing, and it's related, I think, to his reflexive stance. So it's true that many of his fictional pieces are autobiographical. And one of the ways we know that is through Zhou Zuoren's meticulous kind of exegesis of Lucian's writing and trying to pin every detail back down onto some element that is connected to Lucian's biography. But I would say that maybe both of these issues are more broadly maybe epistemic or political issues. I mean, the fact that the inconclusiveness and the reflexivity, I think, are two two sort of substantive positions that Lu Xun holds. So the fact that I think rather than maybe a kind of autobiographical bias in the sense of telling his own story, I think maybe they reveal what Lu Xun sees as the fundamental question of his time, which is this kind of historical moment of indecision, of hesitation between the tradition that's ending, this kind of world that's coming to an end, and kind of uncertain future. So the reflexive kind of staging of these stories and of this narrator is often a device to highlight this ambiguous status of the observer, who's also somehow in a position of indecisiveness, of indecisive teleology, I would say, because we don't know the end of the story. So rather than a lot of other stories that were told in May 4th Times about history moving forwards and going to, you know, some place, Lu Xun never tells us where history is going. So rather than sort of projecting into some utopian future, he reflexively asks us to examine the observer, the person who's telling the story. So that, I think, is very significant for his kind of wariness with respect to ideologies and simple solutions and many of these kind of easy ways out that his contemporaries embraced.
Is Professor Chang Ishin, are you there? Okay, I think she might not be there. So, I mean, let me join the discussion by raising a point or two with Sebastian. I mean, of course, when you mention that, I mean, like the anti-Marxist reflection in Lu Xun, I mean, I think the Marxist or anti-Marxist phase perhaps comes a little later. But if we, I mean, my basic question, which I have been asking myself also for some time, is that especially when you, I mean, in the context of your Mintian intellectuals, and the fact that, I mean, there is no mention much of the coming of the revolution in 1911, and then its eventual subsequent failure. I think that is also very strongly reflected in the Lu Xun's writing, especially the short stories. If you begin with Madman's Diary and Kung Yi Chi and also AQ. So that is one aspect of it. The other aspect, which I find very intriguing, is that, I mean, the term Mintian intellectuals, where does it come from? And the fact that Lu Xun had started serializing AQ in a morning newspaper, and then it gets wide readership and starts an intellectual discussion among the intellectuals, including because there was no party at that time. And if you remember, I mean, Lu Xun had just come back from Japan on the eve of the 1911 revolution in 1909. And then he was a very active participant, if I may say so, in the 1911 revolution, and also then the 1912 Republic of China being established, and he became part of the establishment by joining the education department, etc. And he served for almost a decade. And so I what is interesting to me is this such a strong people's element in Lucian. Because Lucian, of course, this has been written about a lot. Lucian was nowhere exposed to them by that time. And so to call it anti-Marxist, perhaps, I don't know, maybe you can explain it again. So in these context, one, how do you look at such a strong people's concern, pro-people element in Lucian's early writings, and then this Minchian intellectual in itself, how does it come about? Because if we remember Mao's evaluation of 1911 revolution, especially in the debate, because there is a debate which is actually my paper later, that 1911 revolution was a failure. If it was so, and Mao actually in his evaluation of 1911 revolution said that perhaps it was, of course, a progressive forward movement in terms of bringing an end to the Qing dynasty rule. But at the same time, it did not accomplish its goals because perhaps the radical anti-feudal, anti-imperial element was missing in the revolutionary force, which brought about the 1911 revolution. So, viewed in this context, how would you look again at Lucian writing his short stories in this particular phase, and then relating it to Minchian intellectuals? I don't know if I'm clear.
Yes, thank you. Clear, but you're opening a vast kind of area of discussion and inquiry. I think maybe I would be better equipped to answer after listening to your paper. Let me see. So yes, I mean, AQ in some ways is a kind of reckoning with the 1911 revolution, and the kind of the failure of many aspects, many characters in this revolution. I'm actually going to be teaching about the 1911 revolution in just over an hour. So how to make sense of this from Lucian's perspective? I think, well, clearly, AQ is one of the problems. I don't want to deny that. I mean, I don't want to make AQ into too much of a hero in my kind of discussion. Clearly, making AQ into a citizen is going to be a big problem. I think Lucian would acknowledge that. On the other hand, I think all the kind of plans that people like the fake foreign devil might be hatching are also part of the problem. So, of course, Lucian's position is somehow maybe kind of operatic in the sense that there's no way out, right? He doesn't propose any kind of simple reply to the question of what went wrong in 1911, what should have happened differently and so on. So it's true that Lucian became part of the establishment in that sense, but a very alienated member of the establishment. Certainly, I mean, he was working in the education ministry, and he also had this kind of role already as a very influential intellectual around May 4th times. But it's a kind of role that he also tried to shy away from, or to transform in ways that were unexpected or untraditional. So coming to the Minjian issue, so the word Minjian, of course, is somewhat, so I mean, in the sense in which I use it, of course, it comes from my studies of contemporary intellectuals. But you can find the word Minjian in May 4th times and even before. Not in the sense of a Minjian intellectual, so that's not something you would find. But for example, Professor Sun Yu, as I mentioned, has this article about grassroots Lusun, in which I can give you the exact reference, in which it's called 草根语境里的鲁迅, right? Lusun in the in the perspective of grassroots discourse or grassroots context. So in which he talks about Lusun as a Minjian intellectual and how that influenced Xiaohong. So what is a grassroots intellectual in May 4th times? I think there may be an issue of generational divide here. So Lusun, of course, belongs to the generation of the teachers. I mean, in the May 4th movement was largely carried out by very young people, right? People who were in their early 20s or even in their late teens. So Lu Xun at this point was in his 40s, so he was removed by one generation from those people, some of who were his students, who were carrying out the movement. So I think maybe there is some kind of element. So again, in connection with Lu Xun's reading of Russian philosophy or Russian social criticism of Tolstoy, of the texts that inspired him from the Narodnik movement, that he feels that somehow these young people are disconnected from the real China, right? That he has, because of his own biography, and this is where the autobiographical and reflexive element comes in, Lu Xun has a kind of historical depth that he maybe believes the younger generation is lacking. So you can't simply proclaim that China is going to become a republic and everything is going to change because of this historical depth. So I don't think Lu Xun has solutions to offer, but he has something to offer which is something more authentic. His connection with a longer history, his personal entwinement with a longer history of Chinese society, which I think to some extent he believes that the younger people are lacking. So, I mean, anti-Marxist, that's exaggerated. That slipped out of my mouth in a moment, in an unguarded moment. I mean, Marxism is not really yet a big topic in around 1919. It only becomes a topic really in the early 20s. And even then, it's still largely restricted to a somewhat confidential, I mean, very restricted group of people. So, I mean, Lu Xun certainly would have been familiar with some of those Marxist texts. So we know that, for example, the introduction to the Communist Manifesto was published earlier in Tianyi Bao, and some discussions had been going on about these views for about a decade. But there's no indication at this point that Lu Xun thinks that the discussion should be structured around these kind of Marxist view. I think the kind of view of feudalism and imperialism, which Mao later put forward as a kind of guiding framework to understand the 1911 and 1919 movements, is not yet really dominant at this point in Lu Xun's mind.
Thank you. That really opens up the discussion now, and I'm very happy to see Emily Graf there, and I must also share with our participants that I've seen many participants from Japan, from China, and from some other parts are also listening to this, participating in this webinar. As I said in the beginning, that because today is a working day everywhere, and people in the universities have various commitments, so people are coming in and leaving out. So, but anyway, thank you so much to many of our participants who have been very actively involved with us in the past in the Lushun conferences, etc. And I welcome Emily. I can see her there. Emily, do you have a question? Why don't you?
Yes, a very quick one.
Forward? Yeah, please.
Yes,
Yeah, please.
thank you so much for both talks and for having this conference. I was very delighted to see that everybody was getting back together. My question is one about the title of your talk, Sebastian. It's about the hidden tradition. And so I would like you to elaborate on what you meant with hidden. I couldn't quite understand it from your presentation. I'm guessing it has to do because you're giving examples of, the rare examples. You brought that forward. So it didn't appear so hidden at all. But maybe this is also in connection to our discussion afterwards. Is that what you meant by the anti-Marxist element of it all? My question is, what does hidden mean for you? Is it simply overlooked, intentionally covered? What did you mean by hidden? And what do you mean by a tradition? Because that again implies something that is actually very strong and there. And yes, maybe you could elaborate on that. But thanks again, everybody, for the very insightful discussion.
Thank you. Yes, thanks for putting your finger on some of these hidden aspects of my paper. Yes, so hidden tradition is developed a little bit out of some discussion. So Professor Hemant very kindly mentioned my book on Minjian intellectuals in contemporary China. So that's really based on post-1989 developments. So after working on that material for a while, and also presenting it, discussing it with in various contexts, I sort of started to think about what are the precedents for Minjian intellectuals. Is this really something that appears? So my main argument is that, after 1989, there is really a break with the kind of dominant figure of Chinese intellectuals as people who are connected to the social and political elite, who throughout the 20th century have been in a kind of position of maybe critical dialogue, but always a very kind of very eager to be co-opted by state institutions and institutions of official production of knowledge and so on. So the question is, so of course, presenting this material to various historians of various periods, I inevitably got some pushback along the lines of, this is nothing new, it's always been like this, and so on. There have always been other types of intellectuals in China, et cetera, et cetera. So I don't entirely think that's, let's put it this way, I don't think that's entirely documented. I do think that there's a very strong and dominant tradition of entwinement between intellectuals and the state. So that's already, the issue of entwinement of intellectuals with power and production of power and domination is something that's well known around the world in every cultural context. The kind of adjuvant functions of intellectuals described by Gramsci, or the kind of intellectuals' own pursuit of power and position as described by Bourdieu or others. So this is not something that should surprise us. But I do accept the idea that there are people in Chinese history who have tried to challenge this position or this status or this kind of model of the intellectual. And of course, we have anti-conformist, maybe we can call them, heterodox intellectuals in pre-modern China, people like Li Zhi, famous people like Li Zhi or others. But then in May 4th times, we can also find some people like that. So yes, I would say that they are somehow hidden because they are not necessarily highlighted when we discuss May 4th. Or even the kind of intellectual field of 1920s and 1930s China. So people indeed who tried to go beyond their own kind of position as a member of the political dominant group or class and try to kind of excavate these relations of domination and give voice to other people within Chinese society. So some of these folklore movement participants, I think, would be good candidates for that. Some of the journalists, the early journalists or editors who worked in some of the modern printing environment, I think would also be good candidates for that. There's a case to be made for example, school teachers. I mean, you could take a more sociological approach to this kind of problematic. But I don't know actually if they are really a tradition. They are a hidden kind of parallel line. Something like that. Affiliation maybe is a better word than a tradition. You could say that they are a tradition because there is some sense of continuity between them. I mean, you can find people in the 1950s and 60s when you have these sort of early underground groups that are critical of, the hegemony of kind of Marxist discourse in the PRC, and they will refer back to certain strands of May 4th or even Luxun, or even earlier. So you can find some sense of continuity. But whether it really amounts to a tradition, I prefer to leave as an open question. Certainly, so to address one final point that you made, did they hide themselves or were they actively obliterated or obscured? I think a little bit of both. Zhou Zuoren, of course, is an example of someone who was deliberately obscured for a series of reasons. But among others, also because I don't think that he fit into the mold of what was expected of kind of May 4th intellectual, because he was not judgmental enough. He was not, he didn't give clear directions as to, which party to sign up for, which program to endorse, which way to go. So in that sense, I think he was somehow forgotten, both because he was not eager to be so prominent and because he was a bit of a kind of embarrassment to some people.
Thanks so much.
Thank you, Sebastian, for keeping the momentum going. And I can see quite some time that you are visible, but you're not having fee or something.
Sorry, I didn't catch that.
Anyway, almost. We in the final today's event. I also know that I can among the friends. Professor Akiyoshi Japan, who had been participating in our from Japan. With this, if any more questions, either Sebastian or only for previous speak, can take a question before we fall into the final session? Anyone? Or among the speakers, if they have anything to ask the other speakers? Okay, if not, then we will get ready to move into the final session. And before I do that, I must also mention, which I did not earlier, that I must thank ICS put in